So now we're reviewing the AMD RX 6800 non-XT with what little energy we have left in the tank. We're definitely in the negatives at this point. And we're going to be testing this one versus obviously the 3070. We have the 6800 XT numbers, overclocked, non-overclocked numbers, smart access memory on and off numbers, ray tracing, non-ray tracing, just normal rasterization, and power, thermals, a couple of other things. So there's a lot to go through today. Once again, with the card that is positioned about $80 more than the NVIDIA RTX 3070. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial Ballistics Memory, including the nuke hits targeted for use with AMD's new Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Crucial's new Ballistics Max memory is some of the highest performing memory on the market and can be tuned for timings and clocks to improve performance. The company also has its other Crucial Ballistics kits for a more affordable entry to enthusiast-grade memory. Crucial is a Micron brand and has direct access to its own memory supply. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we already have the 6800 XT review live and a 6800 XT teardown live as well. The 6800, we might not do a separate teardown video for it because it's the same thing. It's a little bit skinnier. It is 2 slots instead of 2.5 slots. But in terms of the rest of the assembly, it's about the same exact thing. It's just scaled down and smushed a little bit smaller. So you can check out the 6800 XT teardown if you want to see what we think about how either of these coolers is assembled. It's the same deal. Spoiler alert, they're not great from a thermal standpoint, but the 6800 XT is a little bit worse off relatively versus the 6800 in terms of AMD's reference cooler's ability to cool the silicon, well, and more importantly, the parts around the core silicon, so like the memory and the MOSFETs, because it's dealing with more heat. So that one's a little bit worse off than this. Either way, we typically recommend that you buy a partner model anyway versus the reference designs, especially these older style reference designs where it's just a massive vapor chamber and some fans. But regardless, that's something for future pieces. We're going to be testing this primarily with a focus against the RTX 3070, and that's because it's what it's most directly positioned against, but the pricing has it more in between the 3070 and the 3080, so we've got everything in there. Ultimately, an $80 difference is enough where it might not be feasible for some people to stretch this far, but we'll talk about whether or not we think you should try to reach the budget throughout this review. Starting with our frequency validation plot, this will allow us to determine the clock behavior as compared to the 6800 XT. The RX 6800 XT plots first as a reminder for the first review, with the reported frequency in the range of 2330 to 2350 MHz or so on this intentionally zoomed in scale. Rage mode added 10 to 20 MHz at times, but started off lower than stock and was ultimately pointless in almost every single game we tested. The RX 6800 is the new data. That plots at about 2280 MHz over the course of testing, establishing about a 70 MHz difference between it and the RX 6800 XT. Unfortunately, or maybe not, the RX 6800 does not have rage mode, so the rage mode animations won't be as prevalent for the RX 6800 because it doesn't have rage mode. The next chart shows the RPM response to thermals under auto fan conditions for this testing. This one had the 6800 XT running a stock fan speed of about 1600 RPM in a 21 degrees Celsius ambient in order to maintain its TJ Max target of about 95 degrees Celsius at roughly 41 dBA at 20 inches away. The component thermals were even worse on the 6800 XT, compared to the GPU thermals, that is, but that'll be in a follow-up piece. Average GPU temperature for the XT was in the mid-70s for edge temperature, but junction is what GPU behavior will ultimately follow. As for the 6800 non-XT, the RPM climbed quickly to about 1657 RPM, and it held a steady line. That's ideal. We want to see this straight line as opposed to a more erratic fan behavior, because the flatter the line, the less noticeable it'll be to a human in general, at least within reasonable constraints of not blasting the noise levels too loud. The junction temperature ran at about 84 degrees once at steady state, which is hot for a GPU of this quality, but better than the XT. The average edge temperature was closer to 68 degrees here, Celsius that is, when mapped against this auto fan speed. For acoustics, the fan curve responds mostly the same way as the 6800 XT. Our particular card runs about 30 RPM lower at each given point than the 6800 XT did, but that could just be unit-to-unit variance because fans typically have a plus or minus 10% range on one unit to the next. Either way, a 30 RPM difference has a minimal impact to acoustics, so we'll just show the 6800 XT noise levels chart again because it's basically the same thing. The noise levels max out around 57 dBA on both of these cards. The occurrence of running into this noise level is basically zero unless you manually force it to 100% RPM. So you don't have to worry about that noise level looking high unless you're planning to run these cards with max fan speeds. Otherwise, the auto VBIOS configuration tends to keep both of these cards within the realm of 41 to 43 dBA in our test environment. We discussed Smart Access Memory, or SAM, in our 6800 XT review earlier today, but to summarize, it allows the entirety of GPU memory to be mapped with a resizable base address register such that there will be a minor performance uplift in some games and sometimes up to 10%. Taking advantage of the resizable BAR requires responsible coding on the game developer's part, so not all titles will benefit. Games that would exhibit negative scaling will be prevented from using the feature by AMD, and in the soon future by NVIDIA as well. So game performance will be unaffected at the worst, supposedly anyway, whereas it could technically be a negative if there weren't an explicit whitelist and blacklist, which we're told there sort of is at a driver level, and NVIDIA plans to do something similar. One of the titles from our earlier review that showed definite positive scaling with SAM was Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 6800 non-XT benefited as well at 1080p, with performance rising from 191 FPS stock to 202 FPS with SAM, a 5.7% uplift. NVIDIA's 3070 isn't as close a competitor to the 6800 as the 3080 is to the 6800 XT, so there's no performance leapfrogging going on here. The 6800 is just better. At 4K, the performance scaling was similar, with SAM offering a 3.8% uplift to the 6800. Again, one of the most interesting aspects of SAM in the last review was the potential for the 6800 XT to squeak past the 3080 in performance, while the 6800 is already far enough ahead of the 3070 that it doesn't make much of a difference. Without SAM, it's an 18.7% advantage, and with it, it's 22.7%. So that's a rough start for the 3070 in either of those two scenarios. The DX12 version of Red Dead Redemption 2 may be the one instance where SAM is invisibly disabled, although it reportedly helps a little with the Vulkan version. The change to memory access made no difference in average FPS, nor to the 1% or 0.1% lows, and therefore had no effect on the 6800's decent 10.5% lead over the 3070. The same was true at 4K, but performance for NVIDIA and AMD was much closer here, with the 6800's lead reduced to 2.5%. We tested at all three standard resolutions with Total War 3 Kingdoms and the Battle Benchmark. Starting at 1080p, the 6800's performance rose 1.7% with SAM, increasing its lead over the 3070 FE up to 15.9%, although it's still in a lead without having SAM enabled. At 1440p, not much changed, other than the 3070 FE showing a little instability in 1% and 0.1% lows, as the 3080 did as well at 4K, persisting across multiple test passes. SAM uplift was 1.2% on the 6800, giving it a best case advantage of 13.9% over the 3070 FE. Finally, at 4K, average frame rate got so low that any change resulting from SAM was negligible, with the 6800 going from 37.3 FPS average to 37.6 FPS average. Percent advantage over the 3070 scaling dropped down slightly as well, reduced to an 11.6% lead. As with the 6800 XT, the 6800 showed impressively little change with SAM and Rainbow Six Siege. If average FPS had gone from 433 to 434, for instance, that would be a 0.2% performance uplift, and well within variance. Instead, average frame rate remained entirely unchanged, with minimal variation even in the 1% and 0.1% lows. That leaves the 6800 with a 13.1% lead over the 3070 FE. At 4K, the same behavior from the 6800 XT manifests. Memory bandwidth advantages on the 3070 put it 6.7% ahead of the 6800 for once, while SAM continues to do nothing. We should repeat that SAM doing nothing for a game can imply that it actually isn't enabled for that game and is literally doing nothing. So this behavior isn't unusual and can actually be a good thing if the alternative is negative scaling. PCIe BAR resizing can be blacklisted in scenarios where it produces a bad result. Finally, we have Hitman 2 at 4K, the one game we chose specifically because we knew SAM should have a positive effect. The 6800 gained 10.6% in average FPS, rising from 86.6 to 95.8. The 6800 has a typical lead over the 3070 FE here, But the more notable comparison for this test is with the RTX 3080, which is only 5% ahead of the 6800 with SAM enabled. NVIDIA will enable a feature soon that does at least something similar to what SAM's doing, and the performance gap may open back up then, if it happens or when it happens. But until then, AMD's cards gain a free advantage in select games. It's just not universal. Time to get into the normal game benchmarks, featuring the full suite of GPUs once again. As we said previously, the additional CPU headroom afforded by the Ryzen CPUs doesn't much change the 4K or 1440 results, but it can offer additional headroom in some 1080p tests. Starting with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the AMD RX 6800 reference card sustained 81 FPS average when stock, placing it ahead of the RTX 2080 Ti stock card by 9.8%. That's another stab to the heart of 2080 Ti owners, but such is the life of buying Halo products. More appropriately, the comparison to the RTX 3070 FE stock result of 66 FPS average places the 6800 non-XT in a resounding lead of 23%. It's not even close. At this point, the primary advantage of the 3070 will be RT performance and a theoretically lower price depending on what's available and who sticks to MSRP. The 6800 has a strong lead here though, and overclocking it furthers that lead, pushing it to 86 FPS average with its lows marginally uplifted. The 6800 OC improvement is 5.7%, at which point the stock 3080 and 6800 XT are both roughly 8% ahead. 6800 XT stock versus 6800 stock posts a lead of 15% for the higher end model. If you need older cards, we have some 10 and 20 series and 5700 XT devices on this chart that you can pause and look at. At 1440p, the lead of the 6800 over the 3070 FE scales dramatically, up to a massive 28%. As soon as the 3070 came into existence, it seems the 6800 attempted to snuff it out for non-RT gaming, but there's an asterisk there that we'll get back to later. AMD's lower resolution benefit is expanding the gap. The 6800 OC improves performance by 6.4%, marking the 3080 FE stock card as 3% ahead of the 6800 OC, or 9.5% ahead of stock. The 6800 XT's 164 FPS average has it 17% ahead of the 6800 stock GPU, for intra-architectural comparison. The 1080p results are of limited usefulness at the high end due to everything bouncing off of the same CPU limits and becoming indistinguishable. That includes the 6800 as well. Part of this benchmark has it at the CPU limit, while part of it has it below, and the end result is that the 6800's lead over the 3070 is diminished to only 5% here. The 6800 XT stock and OC results are also within the expanded variance created by an artificial limit, which is imposed by the CPU, so they all look about the same. Total War 3 Kingdoms is up next, first at 4K. The 6800 stock card landed at 37 FPS average here, with lows consistently and tightly spaced behind. This particular test is brutal on all of the GPUs we test, including the 3090 and the 6800 XT. And that's because of the ultra settings used. You could run this at 4K still and at a higher FPS, but with reduced settings and still have a good experience. We just configure it this way for a future-looking benchmark to accommodate more GPU scaling. Regardless, the 6800 stock leads the 3070 stock by 13%, with the 3070 OC not helping much. The 6800 OC pushes it 7.5% higher than it was, but the 6800 XT still maintains a lead of 6% stock to OC, or over the 6800 stock, it's about a 14% lead. The 3080 FE leads the 6800 stock by 26%, just for reference of the higher end. If you saw our 6800 XT review, you likely remember the Three Kingdoms frame time plot that demonstrated in this specific game, and with these higher settings and resolutions, the NVIDIA cards generally were exhibiting more variable frame-to-frame consistency than the AMD cards. This seems to be an outlier title, but it's consistent with this specific title. The 6800 does fine here, with frame-to-frame variability generally no greater than 3 to 5 milliseconds. The RTX 3070 FE, specifically in this title, has frame-to-frame spikes of 8 to 10 milliseconds at times, although this calms down toward the back half of the test. The experience is not game-ruining, but it's plotting worse than AMD's frame times here. At 1440p, the RX 6800 stock card did 76 FPS average, outdoing the RTX 3070 67 FPS average by 14%. The overclocked 6800 improved an impressive 8.8% over stock, or 20% over the RTX 3070 FE overclock. The 6800 XT stock card outperforms the 6800 stock by 15.7%, for anyone debating between the two. And compared to the 5700 XT or 1080 Ti, the modern generation provides meaningful uplift that can help elevate to higher resolutions on more graphically intensive games. We actually aren't hitting a CPU bottleneck at 1080p here, with thanks to those unnecessarily high ultra settings that we referred to earlier. The 6800 stock card does 122 FPS average here, establishing a lead of about 16% over the stock 3070 FE. The overclocked 6800 gains 7.3% over stock and 20% over the overclocked 3070 FE. As for the 6800 XT, it's close enough that the savings may be more valuable for some people without being as convincing of an upgrade path, especially when considering overclocked 6800 performance, although the XT clearly shows that there's room to perform higher with its own OC. Horizon Zero Dawn is next, and we're going to go through these a little faster now. Feel free to pause if the blue bars are progressing too fast. The 6800 stock card did 73 FPS average here with lows at 59 and 50, so they're well spaced. The OC improved by 7% over stock. Compared to the 3070, the 6800 stock card outdid the 3070 stock by 9.5%, while the 3080 maintains a somewhat meaningful lead. The 6800 XT is able to leapfrog in its positioning. At 1440p, the RX 6800 stock card ran at 125 FPS average with the OC at 133. That's still showing good gains though. The RTX 3070 FE ran at 115 FPS average, with the range becoming less significant in a way, with the 6800 XT at 139 FPS average. Finally, at 1080p, the 6800 stock card was well below the CPU limitations and ran at 157 FPS average, making this one of the most reasonable cards to buy if you're intending to max out a 1080p monitor without going too overkill on the GPU performance. Of course, that's assuming higher graphics settings for play. The 6800 outpaces the 3070 FE by 10% in this one. Hitman 2 is back for this test at 4K. The 6800 stock ran 88 FPS average, 48 FPS 1% lows, and 31 FPS 0.1% lows. The OC offered no worthwhile improvement, unfortunately, so it's not always useful. As for the 6800 stock card compared to the 3070, the uplift is again about 20%, so that seems to be about the trend for the scale between these two. The 6800 XT offers about 16% more performance than the 6800 for those who are considering a higher priced option. At 1440p, the Hitman 2 results plots the 6800 stock and OC again next to each other, with the OC offering no value in this title. 6800 XT stock card is 8.9% of the 6800 non-XT stock, reducing its lead at 1440p as a result of the CPU ceiling. The 3070 FE is close to the 6800, marked at 128 FPS average, but not close enough to eradicate the advantage that AMD holds here. Red Dead Vulkan versus DX12 performance scaling is next. We like to show this because people don't know what they're talking about and assume Vulkan always performs the best forever in every scenario. That's true in many cases, but in this game, it's not true for the 6800 or the 6800 XT. The 6800 has a 1.2% deficit with Vulkan when compared to DX12 in our testing, while the 6800 XT carries a 2.53% deficit. NVIDIA shows upwards of 10.5% improvement with Vulkan versus DX12, so the two exchange places with where they traditionally would have been a few generations ago. At 4K and with DX12, the RX 6800 operated 66 FPS average with the OC proving valueless. The RTX 3070 FE is basically the same as the 6800 stock here, leveling the field at 4K. At 1440p, the hierarchy remains about the same as seen here. The 6800 stock card maintains about a 10% lead over the 3070 FE though, so that expands a little bit. The most impressive part of AMD's ray tracing technology for this launch is that it works out of the box with multiple RTX titles. Not all of them. Quake doesn't work, for example, but all the rest that we test do. That doesn't mean it works amazingly well, but it does work. We kept our standard ray tracing test suite for this one at 1080p, despite almost universally beating the RTX 3070 FE in game tests. The 6800 non-XT was outperformed by the 3070 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with RTX shadows enabled by 3.9%. This is the easiest of our RT tests since it's just shadows, but it's still enough to flip the advantage in NVIDIA's favor. At 1440p, the advantage is passed back to AMD, with the 6800 about 1% ahead of the 3070 FE, so they're about tied. In comparison to last gen's cards, the 6800 still lands between the 2080 Super and 2080 Ti as it did at 1080p. Given that the 6800 XT is 16.3% ahead of its non-XT counterpart in this test, the 6800 still holds its own. 4K pushes average frame rates below the level we'd consider acceptable for playing on a PC, with the 6800 averaging 41.5 FPS and its lead over the 3070 Fe is expanded slightly further, up 3% now. NVIDIA's RTX 3080 and 3090 are the only cards that can manage around 60 FPS in this test, though. This is where the testing gets complicated. We don't use DLSS in Tomb Raider, but Control is a valid use case of DLSS, since the DLSS 2 implementation in that game is actually pretty universally regarded as good. AMD doesn't yet have an equivalent that can be toggled on. It's working on super resolution, but for now it doesn't have anything. So we can only gather results with the game rendering at full display resolution for AMD. To account for this, we doubled our test suite to run Control with DLSS on and off with NVIDIA. That way you've got a pure like for like and the more realistic comparison of using DLSS. At 1080p with no DLSS on either card, the 3070 Fe was 28% ahead of the 6800 at 79 FPS average versus 61 FPS average for the 6800. Enabling DLSS pushed the 3070 up to 118 FPS average for a 93% advantage. DLSS is less useful and less good looking at lower resolutions, but these results are still good foreshadowing for performance at higher resolutions. One notch higher at 1440p, the 3070 maintained a similar percent advantage, 26% beyond the 6800. Neither card was able to maintain a 60 FPS average at these settings. Enabling DLSS, though, pushed the 3070 to a much more playable 85 FPS average, now a 110% advantage over AMD, again the latter of which is rendering the full true display resolution. Like SAM, DLSS is a feature that only one card currently has, and the other one doesn't. So it's fair to make these kinds of comparisons, and it goes both ways. Finally, at 4K, the 3070 was 27% ahead of the 6800, approximately the same percent difference as the other two resolutions. Even enabling DLSS only pushed the 3070 up to 47 FPS average. Not a pleasant level of performance to play at, but still 133% beyond the 6800's 20.3 FPS average. That 0.3 is important. Sort of. Minecraft is another title where all of our prior testing was done with DLSS enabled, which is the default setting. We retested the RTX 3070 and 3080 without DLSS for a direct comparison to AMD, and anyone who watched our 6800 XT review already knows how those comparisons went down, including a choice advantage for NVIDIA of over 500% lead against the 6800 XT in one of the tests. For the new numbers, at 1080p, the RX 6800 averaged 41 FPS, which the 3070 exceeded by 86%. Again, that's without enabling DLSS. Using NVIDIA's super sampling raised the 3070's average to 125 FPS, 209% beyond the 6800's result. This is getting beyond the point at which percentage comparisons are even really useful, because at the end of the day, NVIDIA's cards are just way further ahead here than where AMD is currently positioned. At 1440p, the gap widened even without DLSS, with the 3070 Fe now 93% ahead of the 6800. Even then, the 3070 only averaged 48 FPS, and DLSS was required to push the frame rate beyond 60. It allowed the 3070 to run at 102 FPS, now a ridiculous 313% beyond AMD. And remember again that the more path tracing or ray tracing in a title, like in this one, the more AMD will fall behind. Games with only one feature, like shadows or reflections, will still leverage more rasterization performance in their hybrid rendering approach. And so AMD will do comparatively better than here, where it's basically all path tracing or ray tracing depending on what game you're looking at. Given the 1440p results, it's guaranteed that neither card will maintain a playable frame rate at 4K without leveraging DLSS, but a comparison is still possible. The 3070's advantage was approximately the same as the other two resolutions, 88% ahead of AMD without DLSS for NVIDIA, but still only running at 22 FPS. DLSS raised that to an almost okay 50 FPS average, now 329% past the RX 6800. The bottom line here is that some RTX implementations will perform acceptably, like Tomb Raider, and others will require hardware revisions or software trickery like DLSS or an equivalent to run well. Power consumption is next, measured with an interposer at the PCIe slot and with current measurement at the PCIe cables. There are some interesting behaviors that we'll talk about here shortly, including some spikes that we think might have tripped OCP on one of our power supplies. First, for the averages, the FurMark test put the RX 6800 stock card at 237 watts average, alongside the 2080 FE's 237 watts as well. Overclocking increased the power consumption by 15.5%, which aligns cleanly with the 15% offset slider that AMD provides for the stock V BIOS. That lands the 6800 OC at 274 watts, just below the 5700 XT Taichi X. In a gaming scenario, Total War 3 Kingdoms had the 6800 stock card at 240 watts when running the 4K workload, or 223 watts at 1080p, but that's not shown in this chart. The 6800 OC increased by only 5% here, but in a gaming load, there's more variability in power consumption behavior, especially one which isn't a high FPS title, because we're maxing out other parts of the GPU individually. The 3070 FE pulled about 222 watts here, so the 6800 is pulling about 4.9% more power. The 3070 FE OC pushed it up to 244 watts, which is about the same as the stock 6800. One thing we noticed is that the RX 6000 series cards sometimes have large, sudden spikes right at the beginning of a workload. This has been particularly true in Rainbow Six Siege and in FurMark, actually, and we'd assume in other high frame rate titles as well. In this scenario, the spike was to about 320 watts versus 244 watts for the rest of the benchmark. Not shown here, we observed a 160 watt spike in RX 6800 XT power consumption, which was enough to trip, again, we think, OCP on one of our test systems. So this is something we'll look into more. We're seeing the same behavior on the 6800, except the 6800 is a low enough power consumption that it wasn't causing any shutdown issues. Overclock stepping is next, showing our process for testing various overclock settings as we tried to find stability on the card. This is normal as a process for both NVIDIA and AMD. It's just different processes to work through them. AMD, as discussed in the first review, uses a min and max frequency range slider, whereas NVIDIA uses an offset frequency against a baseline instead. For both platforms, you really need to do some sort of scoring benchmarks to validate performance and ensure that the clocks aren't making things worse. With NVIDIA, you'll see this with overly aggressive memory clocks, where it'll look like it's running, but error correction will tank the performance silently and behind the scenes. With AMD, this happens with both the core and the memory. Stock, for example, we saw a 7275 score in Time Spy Extreme here, with a 48 FPS GT1 and 41 FPS GT2. Configuring it to 2400 to 2500 core range without memory overclocking improves 4%, 7575. We saw a hard system crash at 2500 to 2600 that required holding the power button to recover, which is a graceless driver failure, and we'd like to see AMD fix this in the future. At 2450 to 2550, we saw a score of 7764 points, up 6.7 from stock, but as a really important reminder, once again, the number 2450 to 2550 doesn't mean your clock is actually running in that range. It's sort of nebulous what it actually means. It'll be all over the place, but it does increase the frequency as you increase the range. It's just that the frequency doesn't necessarily fall within the range, and certainly not towards the top end of it. Anyway, we were able to get the best results from memory overclocking with a 2100 megahertz clock. 2150, the max that AMD allows, was technically applied and tested, but it routinely plotted worse than 2100. Overall, the OC capabilities are better than we expected, but we still hope for more from partner models. So then, as stated in the 6800 XT review, we normally have a bunch of pressure maps and cold plate flatness testing that we do. We had to move them back to a separate content piece because smart access memory and ray tracing and the extra difficulty of what do you do with DLSS on NVIDIA, that ballooned the testing matrix so much, we had to draw a line somewhere. So you've got smart access memory on-off testing. The sort of TLDR of that is that sometimes it helps and sometimes it's utterly pointless and does literally nothing. But that's by design, because it's possible that with enabling a resizable PCIe BAR, like NVIDIA will be doing soon, or as AMD calls it, using smart access memory, it's possible you could actually have negative scaling from what we understand, but the companies, that'd be NVIDIA and AMD, are working to, at a driver level, tune it so that you either get optimized out of the negatives or they just don't use the feature in those applications. So that's one aspect of this. Smart access memory, you're probably buying a Ryzen CPU anyway right now. That's most likely until Intel responds with something probably first half of 21. So you'll have it if you have a board that's suitable for it. That said, if you can't get smart access memory ready motherboards today, then AMD says it's adding more support for more boards, but also it's not really a feature that we would necessarily hold a build up for if it's going to be months of waiting for a motherboard and you've got the rest of the parts. Although that seems unlikely right now, but we wouldn't wait for it because overall the uplift, while useful sometimes, is not really life-changing in terms of the performance of the card. As for ray tracing performance, it's not even close. NVIDIA is miles ahead of AMD right now in some games, like in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for instance, but also in other games that really only have one type of ray tracing, real-time ray tracing feature. So that might be, it only has shadows, it only has GI, global illumination, it only has reflections. If it's something like that, they're hybrid rendering. Most of what's being drawn on the screen will still be just normal rasterization with that one RT feature thrown in there. And so in those scenarios, the 6800 is closer to the 3070, whereas in scenarios where it's entirely path traced or there's a lot of RT features, maybe it's got GI reflections, shadows, a couple of other things in there, like, I don't know, caustics or something. Once you get into that territory, it's not close. The 3070, the 3080, they're far, far away in the lead, and that's because NVIDIA is on its second generation of ray tracing hardware, and we talked about the hardware solutions in our Ampere architecture deep dive if you want to learn more about that, but AMD is just starting out. For rasterization performance, the 6800 non-XT is actually extremely competitive with the 3070 to the extent that if we just forget the pricing at all for a second and they're priced equally and you don't care about real-time ray tracing performance or optics or anything like that, then, well, we'd probably say get the 6800 because it is outperforming the 3070 in almost all of these gaming scenarios. So that's where it falls. Now, that extra $80 is what complicates it a little more. So we'd recap it this way. First of all, watch the video. Secondly, don't do a TLDR of this TLDR. Watch the video. Thirdly, if you are really interested in real-time ray tracing performance, you should basically ignore AMD right now and just go buy an NVIDIA card at an equivalent price point or as close to it as you can get. The performance is advantaged in almost every way. There may be one or two times that it flipped, but for the most part, NVIDIA is in the lead, and sometimes the lead is insane, depending on, again, if it's like Minecraft or it's fully path traced. Plus, NVIDIA's got the existing ecosystem under it right now because it got there first. So that's what we'd say to do if you want RT performance. If you don't really care about that and you just want a good card for 1080p, 1440p, whatever, sort of quote-unquote normal gaming, then the 6800 is worth considering. However, at an extra $80, it's probably still worth considering. It's just the value is a little bit harder to justify when you consider that the feature set is slimmer versus the competing RTX card. But if you don't care about those features, then they shouldn't weigh on your decision. So that's it for this one. We have more follow-up content coming up on these GPUs. Make sure you subscribe for all of that. And as always, there's a lot of reviews out there. These things, this generation in particular, have gotten so unbelievably complex in terms of the testing matrices that it is definitely worth checking out some other reviews to try and get additional information on how it performs elsewhere in production or workstation or even other gaming scenarios, because there's too much going on now. When you start talking SAM and resizable BAR, and then also just ray tracing versus not, and then also which ray tracing applications do you want to test, and then also the subset of the features of those ray tracing applications like DLSS. So there's too much going on. Check out a couple other reviews, but subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to help us out directly. Go watch our 6800 XT review and tear down if you want to see more on these cards immediately, and we'll see you all next time.